Hello, everyone. This is New World Geopolitics with the December 31st frontline update for the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is obviously going to be the last frontline update for 2023. Just want to wish everyone a happy holiday and go ahead and wish you a happy new year. Keep in mind that there's a lot of changes going on in the front lines right now, which means unfortunately there's a great deal of suffering going on for both Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, all young boys that would prefer to be at home with their families, safe for the holiday season. So keep them in your prayers. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the updates. There was just to start, before we get into all these frontline updates, which we're actually looking at 7 different locations in which the Russians have advanced on Ukrainian lines for a grand total of 20, 30, 36 and a half square kilometers roundabout that the Russians have gained on the Ukrainian army in about a week's time. So I believe this is once again one of the largest territorial changes on the year in terms for a week's time. So before we get into that, I will note that Russian missile attacks have restarted on Ukrainian logistics. It seems like outside of power infrastructure, which of course, was the main target last year, and I'm sure some of which will be targeted this year. Um, it appears like the Russians are going after more Ukrainian barracks, Ukrainian air defense systems. There's a video that seems to indicate at least one Iris T air defense system was targeted by Russian Iskander missiles, several warehouses, several targets in cities like Lvov, Kiev, Odessa. There were large explosions as well. So the largest missile attack actually of the war is what some people are claiming. Up to 122 cruise missiles of various different types went into Ukraine. Ukraine responded with a missile and drone attack on Belgorod, downtown Belgorod, which both missile attacks resulted unfortunately in civilian deaths. So, big event going that went down in Ukraine over the last couple of days. So, in the aftermath of that, and in the wake of that, the Russians have made some advances on Ukraine. The first location we're actually going to speak on is Liman, or not. I'm sorry, not Liman, but Robotny. Robotny, the town, the main site of death and suffering, I guess you could say, for the Ukrainian summer offensive, where the Ukrainians had capped off about 114 square kilometers of Russian territory within that land grab, or it's recaptured Ukrainian territory. I guess I should say within that land grab, the town of Robotny couldn't have had a pre-war population of much more than 100, 150 people. The only town in that area. This is also the location of that first Russian defense line, which is the main, the centerpiece of this report. The Russians have recaptured most of their first defensive line and are rapidly gaining on Robotny. It appears like Robotny is likely going to be recaptured by Russian forces before the end of the winter season. I would guess before before any kind of summer offensive campaign. So in the winter and spring, Robotny is likely a big target, a big media victory. I'm guessing that the Russians are looking to achieve. That way, they can say that Ukraine virtually had no success during their summer offensive. So in total, in this area of Robotny, the Russians have gained 12 square kilometers of territory. Moving on, a quick note on Novo. Let's see here. A quick note on Novo-Mihailovka. I'm actually not. Let's go. I'm going to turn my layers on so I can see. I'm actually having a little bit of trouble loading stuff here on my phone. Hopefully, when I do the overlay, everything works well. But the Ukrainian army has counterattacked and recaptured one of those industrial warehouse districts to the south of town. But the Russians maintain a foothold in the other and also still maintain a foothold on the cemetery area. So a little bit of Ukrainian success there in Novo-Mihailovka, capturing about a third of a square kilometer. It's not a lot of territory, but it is important ground. It's defensible. large structures. So very important ground here. In terms of Marinka, the Russians captured about 3 square kilometers. Finishing off the territory of Marinka, they captured that final street, that final row of houses on the north of town, and have actually moved into the first rows of houses for Grigorivka. So 100% of Marinka now under Russian control, as well as a small fractional percentage of Grigorivka. So the battle for a new town has started here. The Russians have continued to move to the southwest in the fields in the direction of Pobeda. It appears to me like the main target here is actually the town of Konstantinivka. That way, the Russians can cut the roads leading into Vuhledar from the north. So Vuhledar, one of the biggest Russian failures in the war so far. The Russians are now trying to go around that, capturing territory in the area of Marinka, trying to capture Novomihailovka, and hopefully link their forces, hopefully from their perspective, obviously, to link their forces up around Konstantinivka. Now, this obviously, even though it seems like Ukraine is low on manpower, low on equipment, ammunition, this is still going to be a tough fight. It's not uh, the end of the world for the Ukrainian army in this direction. But Russian forces are making much more rapid gains than they have been. So moving on to Avdiivka, there's 2 updates to the map. First, south of the landfill and actually south of the water treatment plant that my guess is works in unison with the coke plant, the steel factory that's in Avdiivka. The Russians have moved into the forest belt and have split 2 of the lines of communications that go in between the lakes and the dachas on each side of the lakes. So we're looking directly east of the Avdiivka coke plant, and the Russians are, cutting roads, cutting lines of communications for Ukrainian troops there. So if the Russians keep advancing in this direction, it's, it's not going to turn out well. It's probably going to lead to the dachas on the eastern side of the lakes falling into Russian hands eventually. To the north of Krasnogorovka, the Russians have continued to advance down the rail line toward Oxcherny, gaining on that rail intersection, and they have also captured another tree line um, going up to the towns of Novo Kalinove and Karamik. So my guess is the Russians are looking to capture Novo Kalinove and Karamik before they capture Avdiivka. It's probably critical that they do so in order to secure that northern flank. Krasnogorovka and the landfill are actually kind of in an exposed position. If the Ukrainians end up mustering enough forces and put enough pressure on the Russians, there's not a lot of room to operate. You're just looking at several back roads and one small town. The Russians are going to want to look to expand that position to several towns, both to the north and south of Avdiivka under their control. And it seems like Karamik, Novokalinove are 2 of those main locations that are ripe for the taking for the Russians. So I would expect the Ukrainian defense to move resources in that direction. All right, so we talked about Robotny, 12 square kilometers in Russian hands. Marinka, about 3 square kilometers in Russian hands. Avdiivka, about 4 square kilometers in Russian hands, and then for Bakhmut, we're looking at about 5 square kilometers falling into Russian hands. The Ukrainians have abandoned some positions that the Russians have moved back into north of Kurdyumovka, giving the Russians some breathing space in that town, where it's actually a conglomeration of 2 or 3 small towns. I expect the Ukrainians a lot of Russian gains are probably going to be made in this area of Klashivka, Andriivka, Kurdyumovka, the territory to the east of the canal. I would guess that most of that will be Ukrainian troops withdrawing from their positions, and the Russians moving into unoccupied territory. So it doesn't seem like the Russians are actually pushing as in this direction as much as they are moving into territory that the Ukrainians are withdrawing from. And the reason for that is this is an exposed position. With the current situation going on around Ivanovska and Bohdanivka, the Ukrainians retaining control of places like Klashivka actually makes them a bit weaker, in my opinion at least, because it extends the line. If the Ukrainians retreat back to a more even line, say, trying to defend in the fields directly to the west of Klishchiivka. They can still hold on to a big chunk of territory that's east of the canal, but when you get further down and like towards Kurdymovka and Klishchiivka itself, that stretches the Ukrainian line a little too far. There's a lot of resources they could be using somewhere else. On the approaches to Ivanovsk, the Russians have finished capturing the Bakhmut airport as well as some fields to the south of that. To the north of that, they have virtually captured all the territory around the lake that's in the small town of Kromove. And then on the hill, the most important positions, the Russians have captured the cemetery and have moved into that all important forested area that's along the ridge line that defends Ivanovska from the north. So if the Ukrainians can't throw the Russians back from that forested area, if the Russians manage to capture all that and they continue moving to the west, Ivanovsk is going to fall. They're going to be surrounded on three different sides from three different directions. One of those directions being the high ground. Ivanovsk is actually in a depression; it's in the low ground. So if the Russians advance on Ivanovsk from the north, as well as from the south and um, what direction are we talking about here? East. So the north, south, and east is going to be extremely difficult, almost impossible to hold that city, to hold that village. So I expect the Ukrainians would withdraw from Ivanovka and focus on the defense of Chasiv Yar at that point. North of this forest belt, the Ukrainians actually recaptured some territory along the intersection of the Ivanovka Bohdanivka road that intersects with the rail line. That is a big gain to recapture that territory. However, Bogdanovka itself is quickly falling into Russian hands. About half the town now occupied by the Russian army, with some Ukrainian fortifications north of that falling into Russian hands, as well as some Ukrainian fortifications on the approaches to Grigorovka. So it looks like Russia is looking to capture Grigorovka, capture Bogdanovka, capture Ivanovska, Klishchiivka, push Ukraine back beyond the canal and begin the battle of Chasiv Yar at some point next year, perhaps by the time we get to summer, or maybe even sooner than that. So moving up to the north, Seversk, the Russians have captured about 6 square kilometers in the area around Seversk. Moving up that rail line to, I believe, Vyamovka is what it's called. This is near Sporne. I apologize. On my map, the labels aren't loading for this particular area. Sporne itself, the Russians have moved back into the town, this time not in the north, which has seen most of the back and forth over the last couple months, but in the south, the Russians have captured the industrial warehouse zone of Sporne. So, nothing. I would say any news from Sporne, kind of like some other places from the battlefield, I would take with a grain of salt because it goes back and forth here so much. It must be the terrain, just the way it's laid out. Each side has a difficult time pushing the other out of position and an easy time recapturing the positions that they lose. So we'll see about Sporne in the coming weeks if the Russians can actually hold on to it or completely capture it or not. So in the area of Cherny, this is along the Zhrubets River, the lakes actually that separate, that kind of run close to the border between Donetsk and Lugansk in the north. The Russians have gained some ground here, about 6.5 square kilometers, moving up into some forested areas and forest belts, trying to reach a string of villages along that eastern bank of the Zhrubets River. Terney, Neveske, Makivka, all these towns, definitely Russia's want to bring back under their control. That way they can start putting pressure on Ukrainian forces in Liman and hopefully recapturing their positions on the Oskil River. Hopefully for them, not hopefully for the Ukrainians, of course. So, all in all, over 36.5 square kilometers under Russian control within a week's time, closer, probably closer to 40. Keep in mind, I drew all these lines and I did all these updates on my phone, so they're not as accurate as they could be, but it's the best I could do right now. So Thanks for tuning in, and that's all from me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Consider following us on Twitter and Telegram, and everyone have a happy new year.